When I walked into Bellamy Industries for what everyone believed was my first day as their mysterious new chief executive officer, I never expected the shock and horror that would wash over my husband's face. 24 hours earlier, James had confidently introduced his executive assistant, Veronica, to our 12th anniversary dinner at Osteria Verde, the same restaurant where he had proposed to me all those years ago. I'd watched in silent disbelief as they exchanged knowing glances over champagne glasses, his hand occasionally brushing against hers when he thought I wasn't looking. Now, sitting at the head of the boardroom table that had once been his domain, I savored the moment his practiced smile disintegrated into panic as our eyes met. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Eleanor Prescott, the board chairwoman, "I'd like to introduce Bellamy Industries' new CEO, Katherine Summers." The room erupted, in polite applause while James remained frozen, his complexion draining to the color of the papers scattered before him. The crystal tumbler in his hand trembled slightly, sending ripples through his morning scotch, a vice I'd warned him about for years. The security guard had handed me my temporary badge with practiced efficiency that morning, unaware of the seismic shift about to rock the company's foundations. "Visitor pass for Katherine Summers," he'd said, sliding the credential across the granite counter. I'd smiled, knowing the contract in my leather portfolio clearly stated, "Chief Executive, Officer." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 12 years of marriage, I was now merely a visitor in James's professional kingdom. But by day's end, he would be the outsider. I'd arrived deliberately early, watching the morning sunlight bounce off the gleaming 60-story tower that housed Bellamy Industries. The building had always represented James's ambition, cold, imposing, reaching ambitiously skyward with little regard for what surrounded it. For years, I'd stood in its shadow, my own career in financial forensics taking a backseat to his meteoric rise. I'd tracked corporate fraudsters while ignoring the deception unfolding in my own marriage. As I'd taken the private elevator to the executive floor, the same elevator where James had once proudly shown me his empire during a company Christmas party, I had allowed myself a moment to appreciate how perfectly my plan had unfolded. The board's unanimous vote last week had been the culmination of 6 months of careful groundwork, initiated the day after I discovered the first incriminating email on James's carelessly unlocked iPad. The mahogany boardroom doors had opened, before me like a theatrical curtain, revealing the executive team seated around an enormous table. Their curious expressions had shifted to polite smiles as Eleanor introduced me, none of them yet understanding the connection between the company's mysterious new CEO and their CEO, James Summers. No one, that is, except James himself, whose features now contorted as he struggled to maintain composure. His eyes telegraphed the frantic calculations surely racing through his mind. How had his wife of 12 years, the woman he'd so casually betrayed just yesterday, managed to secretly secure the CEO position at his company? And more urgently, what did this mean for the financial maneuverings he thought were safely buried in creative accounting and offshore entities? "Katherine comes to us with impeccable credentials," Eleanor continued. Her background in financial forensics and corporate fraud investigation, along with her innovative approach to sustainable business practices, makes her uniquely qualified to lead Bellamy Industries through its upcoming expansion. James's grip tightened around his tumbler, knuckles whitening as our eyes met across the polished expanse of the table. In that moment of locked gazes, 12 years of shared history flashed between us. The early days of mutual ambition and support, followed by his gradual transformation into someone I barely recognized, culminating in yesterday's humiliation at Osteria Verde. "I'm honored to join Bellamy Industries," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil beneath. "I look forward to working with each of you to bring transparency and ethical leadership to every aspect of our operations." The word transparency landed like a precision strike. James's composed facade cracked further, a muscle twitching visibly at his jaw. He knew exactly what lay hidden in the company's labyrinthine accounting, What would be exposed under the scrutiny I planned to implement immediately? As I took my seat at the head of the table, his former seat, I opened my portfolio to reveal the detailed agenda for my first day as CEO. The first item, highlighted in bold, comprehensive financial. Audit all departments. Before we jump back into my confrontation with James, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this story strikes a chord with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's video reveals how James tried to sabotage my position in the weeks that followed, and the unexpected ally I found within the company. You won't want to miss it. The tension in the boardroom was palpable as I maintained unwavering eye contact with James across the table. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent of conflict but unable to pinpoint its source. Only Eleanor seemed to understand the full significance of the moment, her slight nod in my direction confirming our carefully orchestrated plan was unfolding perfectly. For those who don't know me, I continued, deliberately pausing to let the implications sink in. I've spent the last decade heading the financial forensics division at Vertex Consulting, specializing in uncovering corporate fraud and financial mismanagement. James's right hand trembled as he reached for his water glass, sloshing liquid onto the pristine table surface. The woman to his left, Victoria Reeves, head of marketing, slid a napkin toward him with a concerned glance. "Are you all right, James?" she whispered, loud enough for nearby executives to hear. "Fine," he managed through clenched teeth, dabbing at the spill while keeping his eyes fixed on me. "Just surprised by the unexpected announcement." Eleanor cleared her throat. The board's decision to bring Katherine on was unanimous, though. We kept the selection process confidential until today for strategic reasons. Strategic reasons indeed. The board had been initially reluctant to meet with me 6 months ago. When I first approached Eleanor with evidence of financial irregularities I'd discovered while examining Bellamy's public filings. The patterns had been subtle, but unmistakable. To someone with my training, discrepancies in reported earnings, suspicious timing of asset acquisitions, and inconsistencies in foreign subsidiary reporting. "I believe we should proceed with today's agenda," I said, distributing folders to each executive. "You'll find my proposal for the first 100 days, including a comprehensive financial review of all divisions, enhanced transparency measures, and a restructuring of our environmental compliance protocols." James flipped open his folder, eyes widening, as he scanned the contents. I knew exactly what had caught his attention. The detailed audit would focus heavily on the Southeast Asian acquisitions and the Cayman Islands holding company he'd established 3 years ago, precisely where I'd traced the most significant irregularities. "This seems excessive," he offered, attempting to regain his composure. "Our current financial oversight is already robust. Perhaps as CEO, you might want to focus first on understanding our existing processes before implementing such sweeping changes." Several executives nodded in agreement. Loyalists James had cultivated over years of strategic lunches and golf outings. "I appreciate your concern, James," I replied, my voice cool and professional despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. "But my analysis of Bellamy's financial reporting suggests otherwise. In fact, the board has already approved this review process." I thought back to the dinner just 24 hours earlier, our anniversary celebration that had turned into a nightmare. I'd arrived at Osteria Verde first, requesting the same corner table where James had proposed. The maitre d' had seated me with a knowing smile, complimenting the pearl necklace James had given me on our 5th anniversary. I'd ordered a bottle of champagne, determined to maintain dignity despite what I knew would happen. When James arrived 20 minutes late, my heart had still foolishly hoped I was wrong. Perhaps the emails, the late nights, the unexplained charges had alternative explanations. Then Veronica had appeared behind him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, diamond bracelet glinting under the restaurant's soft lighting. "Katherine," he'd said with practiced casualness. I hope you don't mind that I invited Veronica. She's been instrumental in the Singapore project, and I thought she deserved to celebrate its success with us. The Singapore project. The very operation at the center of my investigation, where $37 million had apparently vanished into consulting fees to a shell company that existed only on paper. Back in the boardroom, Eleanor directed the conversation toward quarterly projections, but the undercurrent of tension remained. James kept glancing at his phone beneath the table, undoubtedly messaging his allies throughout the company, scrambling to erect defenses against the investigation he knew was coming. Before we move on, I interjected, I should mention that as of this morning, I've implemented a new data security protocol. All financial systems now have enhanced monitoring, and any unusual activities will trigger immediate notifications to our new compliance team. It was a calculated move, letting James know that his digital movements would be tracked. Any attempts to delete or alter records would be flagged instantly. His face darkened as the implications registered. That seems like an overreach on your first day, he challenged, a hint of his usual arrogance returning. Changes of that magnitude typically require departmental review and gradual implementation. Eleanor intervened smoothly. The board has given Katherine full authority to implement whatever security measures she deems necessary, effective immediately. Now, shall we continue with the quarterly projections? As the meeting progressed, I watched James's desperate glances toward his closest allies on the executive team, Marcus in operations, Diane in legal, Philip in technology. None would meet his eyes directly, already sensing the shifting power dynamics and calculating their own positions in the new order. By the time the meeting concluded 2 hours later, the battle lines had been drawn. Half the room recognized the winds of change and had subtly aligned themselves with my agenda. The other half, James's longtime supporters, remained wary but uncertain, sensing something significant had shifted, but not yet understanding the full dimensions of the confrontation unfolding before them. The security officer, Thomas, handed me the access keycard to James's former office, now mine, with a barely concealed smile. All codes have been reset as requested, Ms. Summers. The IT team completed the transition at 5 a.m. He paused, lowering his voice. If I may say so, ma'am, this change is long overdue. An interesting comment from someone I'd never met before. I made a mental note to learn more about Thomas later. Clearly, there were allies throughout the organization I hadn't yet identified. Thank you, Thomas. Has Mr. Summers been issued his new credentials? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, ma'am. His access has been restricted to the 14th floor, as specified by Ms. Prescott. Security has been notified that he no longer has executive floor privileges unless accompanied by yourself or a board member. I nodded, suppressing a smile at the thought of James, who had always flaunted his executive status, being relegated to a standard office 14 floors below. The man who had casually brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner was about to experience what it felt like to lose not just his position, but his carefully constructed identity. The executive floor hummed with activity as I approached the corner office. Through the glass walls, I could see Maria, the assistant James and I had once shared when we were both climbing our respective career ladders, before he convinced me to focus on supporting his journey. She stood nervously beside the desk, rearranging items with unusual precision. Good morning, Maria, I said, watching her expression carefully as she turned to face me. Her eyes widened in recognition, then quickly schooled themselves into professional neutrality. Ms. Summers, they told me the new CEO was arriving today, but I didn't realize, that is, I wasn't informed. She stumbled over her words, clearly calculating how this dramatic shift in power would affect her own position. It's been a while, I acknowledged. Almost 5 years since we last worked together. 5 years since James had suggested Maria would be more valuable focusing exclusively on his needs as he ascended to the CEO position. 5 years during which she had undoubtedly been privy to his indiscretions, his financial manipulations, perhaps even his affair with Veronica. I hope we can work together effectively again, I continued, setting my briefcase on the desk, the same custom mahogany piece James had commissioned when he was promoted. That depends largely on your priorities moving forward. Maria swallowed. Visibly. Of course, Ms. Summers. My priority is always the company's best interests. Is it? I questioned mildly, removing my coat and draping it over the chair. I rather thought your priority was James's best interests. Those haven't necessarily aligned with Bellamy's for some time now. Her face paled. I simply follow the directives of my supervisor. And now that's me. I sat down, noting how the chair had been adjusted to James's height, a small thing, but another reminder of his previous occupation of this space. So let me be clear about my first directive. Complete honesty. What did you know about the Singapore project? Maria's eyes darted toward the door, but she remained rooted in place. I only handled the scheduling and communications. The financial details were managed directly by Mr. Summers and the offshore team. The offshore team, I repeated. You mean Marston Consulting Group? The firm that exists only on paper and somehow received $37 million for services that were never specified or delivered. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her. I was only instructed to forward correspondence to a particular email address. I never met anyone from the company personally. I opened my laptop, turning the screen toward her. This email address? Operated by a server in the Cayman Islands, registered to a shell corporation that, interestingly enough, lists James as a beneficial owner through 3 layers of holding companies? Maria's composure finally cracked. Please, Ms. Summers, I have 2 children in college. I simply did what I was told. I didn't ask questions. That's precisely the problem with Bellamy, Maria. Nobody asked questions. Not when James redirected research funds to untraceable accounts. Not when environmental compliance reports were falsified. Not when a qualified female executive was passed over for promotion because she wouldn't sleep with a board member. I leaned forward. That culture of silence ends today. The intercom buzzed, mercifully interrupting our tense exchange. Eleanor Prescott's voice came through clearly. Katherine, James is demanding an emergency meeting with the board. He's making quite a scene in the reception area. I pressed the response button. I'll be right out. Maria's eyes were wide with apprehension. What will happen now? That depends on your next move, I replied, gathering my tablet. My office will need complete records of all communications regarding the Singapore project, the Marston Group, and any other offshore entities James worked with. You have until the end of day. But Mr. Summers instructed me to keep those communications strictly confidential. Mr. Summers is no longer CEO, I cut in sharply. And you need to decide whether your loyalty lies with him or with acting legally and ethically. One path leads to continued employment, possibly even advancement. The other, I let the implication hang in the air. She straightened her shoulders, decision made. I'll have everything compiled by 5 o'clock. I nodded. Good. And Maria? I know about the document shredding last month. All of it. If anything is missing, from what you provide, I'll know. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed my suspicion. James had already begun covering his tracks, likely after I'd confronted him about the first suspicious email I'd discovered. What he didn't know was that I'd been monitoring his activities for months, creating backup copies of everything he thought he was destroying. As I walked toward the reception area, employees stopped to stare, whispers following in my wake. The news of my appointment, and my relationship to James, had clearly spread throughout the building with lightning speed. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity, and a surprising number displayed what looked like satisfaction. James stood by the receptionist's desk, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and the stubble on his jaw suggested he hadn't bothered shaving that morning. When he spotted me approaching, his expression darkened from frustration to fury. "There you are," he spat, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job," I replied evenly. "If you'd like to discuss company matters, we can do so in a private meeting room, with HR present." "This isn't about company matters," he hissed, stepping closer. "This is about you manipulating the board with your vindictive lies because you're upset about our marriage." Several employees nearby froze, openly listening now. Eleanor emerged from a nearby conference room, her expression concerned but resolute. "James," she warned, "this is neither the time nor the place. Katherine has offered to meet with you professionally. I suggest you accept that offer before you make your situation worse." His laugh was bitter and hollow. "My situation? Do you have any idea what she's doing? She's using her position to wage a personal vendetta." "This is enough," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Security, please escort Mr. Summers to conference room C. Katherine and I will join him momentarily with a representative from Human Resources." As Thomas and another security officer approached, James's face flushed deeply. "This is my company," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You can't treat me like some common employee." "Actually," I replied softly, "that's exactly what you are now. A common employee with an uncomfortably large number of questions to answer about financial discrepancies. I suggest you comport yourself accordingly." The conference room door closed with a soft click behind us, sealing James, Eleanor, myself, and Natalie Chen from HR into a tense bubble of confrontation. James immediately claimed the chair at the head of the table, a transparent attempt to assert dominance in a room where he no longer commanded authority. "This is absurd," he began, loosening his tie further. "The board can't seriously believe whatever Katherine has told you. She's clearly emotionally compromised and using her professional connections to strike back at me over personal matters." Eleanor remained standing, her posture elegant but unyielding. "James, let me be perfectly clear. Katherine did not approach the board with marital grievances. She came to us with meticulously documented evidence of financial improprieties that, if verified through our ongoing audit, constitute serious violations of corporate governance, SEC regulations, and possibly federal law." His expression faltered momentarily before the practiced mask of confidence returned. "What supposed evidence? Our financials are reviewed quarterly by Patterson and Winthrop. If there were irregularities, they would have flagged them." "Patterson and Winthrop," I repeated thoughtfully, taking the seat directly opposite him. "The same accounting firm where your fraternity brother Thomas Patterson is managing partner. The firm that somehow failed to identify $37 million in questionable payments to a shell company." Interesting coincidence. James's right eye twitched slightly, a tell I'd noticed years ago when he felt cornered. Those payments were legitimate. Consulting fees for the Singapore expansion. Everything was properly documented and approved. "By you," I said. "You approved payments to a company you secretly owned for services never rendered, using a chain of shell corporations to obscure the money trail. That's not merely an ethical breach, James. It's textbook fraud." His gaze darted between Eleanor and Natalie, searching for any sign of doubt he could exploit. Finding none, he shifted tactics. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. As CEO, I structured complex international transactions to minimize our tax burden. Perfectly legal financial engineering that Katherine, with her limited corporate experience, has misinterpreted." The condescension in his voice when referencing, "My career made my blood boil, but I maintained my composure." The same dismissive tone had characterized countless dinner conversations over the years, as he'd systematically undermined my professional confidence while building his empire of deception. My experience in financial forensics is precisely why I recognize the patterns, I replied evenly. The board found my analysis compelling enough to warrant further investigation. and to appoint me CEO while that investigation proceeds. Which brings us to the matter at hand, Eleanor interjected, finally taking a seat. James, in light of the ongoing audit and the serious nature of these allegations, the board has decided to place you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Administrative leave? His voice rose sharply. That's outrageous. I built this company from a regional player to an international powerhouse. Our stock price has tripled under my financial leadership. A stock price potentially inflated by fraudulent reporting, I noted, opening a folder before me. These documents show systematic misrepresentation of quarterly earnings dating back at least 3 years, with the most egregious manipulations coinciding with your executive compensation milestones. Quite convenient? Natalie Chen slid a document across the table. This outlines the terms of your administrative leave, including continuing compensation during the investigation period, and the strict confidentiality requirements regarding company matters. James ignored the paper, leaning forward with his attention fixed on Eleanor. This is a coup orchestrated by my wife after finding out about Veronica. Don't let her personal vengeance destroy everything we've built. Veronica Bryant, I said, calmly, who was mysteriously promoted from entry-level analyst to senior investment director in 18 months, bypassing dozens of more qualified candidates. The same Veronica who accompanied you on 14 business trips last year, all charged to the corporate account, including a week at the Grand Cayman Ritz-Carlton where, curiously, no business meetings were scheduled. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Slightly, this particular detail hadn't been included in my report to the board. James's face darkened as he realized I had been tracking his indiscretions far more comprehensively than he'd suspected. My personal life is irrelevant to this discussion, he snapped. Ordinarily, I would agree, Eleanor responded. However, using corporate funds to finance an extramarital affair does fall within the scope of our investigation, as does preferential treatment in hiring and promotion decisions. James stood abruptly, sending his chair rolling backward. This is a coordinated attack on my reputation. I won't sit here and be ambushed. Actually, I said, you will. Because this ambush, as you call it, is just the beginning. The documentation, establishing your connection to Marston Consulting, has already been provided to the audit committee. The board has authorized full forensic access to all financial systems, including the encrypted server in Geneva you thought no one knew about. His face paled visibly. The Geneva server had been his most closely guarded secret, containing the true documentation of his offshore activities. I had discovered its existence only by chance, noticing a recurring IP address in his browser history. During one of his careless moments, "You had no right to access my private—" "I didn't need to," I interrupted. "You logged into it from our home network repeatedly. The access records alone were enough to establish its existence. The court order to examine its contents was issued yesterday. This was a calculated bluff. We hadn't yet secured legal access to the server, but James's reaction confirmed its importance. He sank slowly back into his chair, the implications washing over him in visible waves. "You've been planning this for months," he said, his voice hollow with realization. "While sleeping beside me, sharing our home, you were building a case against me." 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, I confirmed. Beginning the morning, I found the first email about the Singapore payments on your iPad. You really should change your passwords more frequently, James. The irony wasn't lost on me. Throughout our marriage, James had consistently underestimated me, treating my career as a charming hobby rather than recognizing the expertise I had developed in exactly the field that would ultimately expose his crimes. His bedside iPad had been carelessly unlocked that morning, a notification from an unfamiliar email account catching my attention while he showered. "What do you want?" he finally asked, defeat creeping into his voice. "If this is about Veronica—" "This isn't about Veronica," I cut him off sharply. "Your affair is merely a symptom of your larger character failure. This is about justice. For the shareholders you defrauded, the employees whose pension fund you endangered, and the environmental regulations you circumvented to save costs. Eleanor nodded approvingly. The board is unified on this matter, James. You will turn in your company devices immediately, sign the administrative leave agreement, and cooperate fully with the investigation. Your future at Bellamy depends entirely on the findings of that investigation. And if I refuse? Natalie Chen spoke for the first time, her voice coolly professional. Then your employment will be terminated for cause immediately, with all evidence of potential wrongdoing forwarded directly to the SEC and Department of Justice without the mitigating context the internal investigation might provide. The four of us sat in tense silence as James weighed his limited options. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see employees moving through their morning routines, many casting curious glances toward our meeting. News of the IU's confrontation in reception had clearly spread. Finally, with movements that suggested barely controlled rage, James reached for the administrative leave document and scrawled his signature at the bottom. "This isn't over, Katherine," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You've made a serious miscalculation. There are aspects of these arrangements you don't understand. People involved who won't simply stand aside while you dismantle everything." "Is that a threat, James?" I asked, loudly enough for Eleanor and Natalie to hear. "A warning," he replied, standing once more. "From someone who still remembers when you were on my side." As he moved toward the door, I called after him. "One last thing, James. The anniversary gift you gave me last night during our disastrous dinner, the diamond bracelet identical to the one Veronica was wearing, I had it appraised this morning. The diamonds are synthetic, despite the Cartier certificate you included. Fake, like so much else about you." His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around, continuing through the door where Thomas waited to escort him to clear out his personal items. The afternoon sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive floor as I worked my way through James's digital files. His administrative credentials had been transferred to my system, opening a labyrinth of folders, encrypted documents, and communication threads that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Bellamy Industries' operations under his financial leadership. "Ms. Summers?" Maria appeared at my door, arms laden with file folders. "I've gathered everything you requested regarding the Singapore project and the offshore entities." She placed the stack on my desk, hovering nervously as I examined the top folder. "This appears comprehensive," I noted, flipping through meeting minutes and transaction records. "Though I notice there's nothing here from before 2019. Maria shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Summers had me transfer all records older than 3 years to secure storage last December. He said it was part of a new document retention policy." "Convenient timing," I observed, right around when the Singapore project payments accelerated. "Where exactly is this secure storage?" "A facility in North Arlington, Sentinel Document Management." I made a note to send our legal team to retrieve those files immediately. James's attempt to distance himself from older documentation suggested the irregular activities might extend further back than I had initially suspected. "There's something else," Maria said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Something I think you should know." She glanced at the open door, clearly concerned about being overheard. I rose and closed it, then returned to my desk, gesturing for her to continue. "Last month, Mr. Summers had me book a series of unusual meetings, not through the normal calendar system, but in a separate schedule he kept private. Meetings with individuals who never signed in through reception and weren't listed in any company directory. My interest piqued. "Do you have names?" "Only initials in his private schedule. RM, DK, and someone he referred to only as the Commissioner. They always met in the executive dining room after hours when most staff had left." The Commissioner, a strange moniker that triggered alarm bells. "When was the most recent meeting?" 3 days ago, the day before your anniversary dinner," The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something had transpired in that meeting that had made James confident enough to bring Veronica to our anniversary dinner. A brazen move even for him. What had changed? What assurance had he received that made him believe he was untouchable? "There's one more thing," Maria continued, reaching into her jacket pocket and removing a small USB drive. "Mr. Summers instructed me to destroy this last week, but I kept it. It contains recordings of those private meetings. He used the executive dining room security system to record conversations. Said it was for his insurance policy." I accepted the drive with measured calm, though. My pulse quickened. "You realize this could be extremely significant to our investigation." She nodded, a decision visibly solidifying behind her eyes. "I've worked at Bellamy for 17 years, Ms. Summers. I've seen how Mr. Summers operates, the corners he cuts, the people he steps on. I should have spoken up sooner, but he made sure everyone around him was complicit in small ways," I finished for her, making it harder for anyone to come forward without implicating themselves. "Exactly." Relief washed over her face at being understood. The Singapore project wasn't the first questionable operation, just the largest. There were smaller instances. Environmental, compliance reports altered just enough to pass inspection. Safety violations at the Milwaukee plant covered up after that worker was injured. Research data manipulated to fast-track the Helios product despite known defects. Each revelation added another layer to James's web of corruption. What had begun as a financial investigation was expanding into something far more comprehensive and disturbing. "Your cooperation won't be forgotten, Maria," I assured her. "Documentation like this, provided voluntarily before being requested, will be viewed favorably by both the board and any external investigators." After she left, I inserted the USB drive into my laptop, taking care to first disconnect from the company network as a security precaution. The drive contained 12 audio files, each labeled only with dates spanning the past 6 months. I selected the most recent, recorded 3 days ago, and pressed play. James's voice emerged from my laptop speakers, confident and relaxed. "The quarterly numbers have been adjusted as discussed. Patterson's team will sign off without additional scrutiny." Deeper voice responded, one I didn't recognize. "The commissioner is satisfied with the arrangements, but concerned about the environmental compliance situation at the Carolina facility. The EPA has assigned a new regional director who may not be as amenable as his predecessor." "Already handled," James replied smoothly. "We've retained Senator Blackwood's former chief of staff as our regulatory consultant. He's assured us that inspections can be delayed until after the remediation is complete." "And the timeline for that remediation?" A pause, then James again. "Officially, 18 months. Unofficially, we can stretch it to 36 while showing sufficient progress to satisfy regulatory requirements. The cost savings are factored into the Q3 projections." "Good. Now about your wife." I leaned forward, tension coiling through my body. "What about her?" James's tone sharpened noticeably. "The commissioner is concerned about her position at Vertex Consulting. Their forensic finance division has contracted with the SEC on several recent investigations. It presents a potential vulnerability." James laughed dismissively. "Katherine is focused on her own clients. She has no access to or interest in Bellamy's financials. Besides, I've been encouraging her to scale back her practice. She's been talking about consulting only part-time, to focus on that literacy nonprofit she's passionate about." A different voice entered the conversation, smoother and more articulate. "Nevertheless, the proximity is concerning. Perhaps it's time to accelerate the discussion about your personal situation." "Meaning?" James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The commissioner feels that your marital status has become inconvenient to our larger objectives. The Nexus acquisition will require restructuring that would be complicated by communal property considerations. My breath caught. They were discussing my marriage as a business liability to be eliminated. The third voice continued, I understand tomorrow is your anniversary. 12 years, correct? Perhaps it's an appropriate juncture for transition. James's response came after a calculating pause. I've been considering the timing. There are certain developments in my personal life that might facilitate a natural separation. Veronica Bryant, the deeper voice stated matter-of-factly. Your relationship hasn't gone unnoticed. The commissioner doesn't object to the association, but suggests formalizing your separation from Katherine before proceeding further with Ms. Bryant. Cleaner from a financial and operational perspective. I've made dinner reservations for tomorrow night, James replied. Our usual anniversary venue. It might be an appropriate occasion to clarify the situation. The recording continued with discussion of the Nexus acquisition strategy, but I had stopped actively listening, my mind reeling from the implications of what I'd just heard. The anniversary dinner hadn't been a spontaneous humiliation. It had been a calculated business decision, encouraged by this mysterious commissioner and planned in advance. My marriage, like everything else in James's life, had been evaluated solely for its utility to his ambitions. I ejected the USB drive and secured it in my desk safe, then buzzed Eleanor's office. Eleanor, I need to brief you and the audit committee immediately. We have new evidence suggesting external pressure on our financial reporting, possibly extending to regulatory interference. And I believe we need to accelerate our investigation into the Nexus acquisition plan. External pressure? She repeated, concern evident in her voice. From whom? Someone referred to only as the commissioner. And based on the context, I don't think it's a government official, at least not one acting in an official capacity. There was a lengthy pause before Eleanor responded. Katherine, proceed with extreme caution. Document everything, but contain this information to essential personnel only until we better understand what we're dealing with. The warning in her tone was unmistakable, heightening my already significant concerns. What had begun as an investigation into financial fraud was evolving into something more complex and potentially dangerous. I ended the call and turned to the window, gazing out at the city skyline as afternoon shadows lengthened across the urban landscape. Somewhere out there was the mysterious commissioner who had discussed my marriage as a business impediment. Someone with enough influence to pressure James into accelerating our divorce for corporate convenience. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Garage Level B, South Corner, 5:30. Come alone if you want the complete Singapore. Files. Not what you think. I stared at the anonymous text message, instinct and training battling within me. Every principle of personal safety screamed against meeting an unknown contact in a deserted parking garage. Yet my investigator's intuition, the same one that had first alerted me to James's financial manipulations, whispered that this message contained a thread of truth worth pursuing. Ms. Summers? Thomas knocked lightly on my open door. Security. Sweep is complete on this floor. No unusual devices found. I'd requested the security sweep after discovering the recorded meetings, concerned that if James had been recording conversations, he might have implemented other surveillance measures as well. Thank you, Thomas. Can I ask you something off the record? I gestured for him to close the door. He complied, standing at parade rest, a habit that suggested military background. Of course, ma'am. How well do you know the company's parking structures? Every inch, he replied without hesitation. I personally oversee the security protocols for all Bellamy properties, including the 3 parking levels. Level B, South Corner. What's there? His expression remained professionally neutral, but I detected a flicker of concern. That's a low-traffic area near the emergency generators. Limited camera coverage due to some infrastructure issues we've been working to address, which explained why someone would choose it for a clandestine meeting. If someone wanted to have a conversation there without being observed, would it be possible Thomas considered this carefully before responding. There's a blind spot where the security cameras don't quite overlap. It's been on my upgrade list for months, but Mr. Summers repeatedly denied the budget request. How convenient. Is there a way to monitor that area temporarily, without being obvious about it? He caught on immediately. You've received a message, suggesting a meeting there? Yes. Ma'am, I strongly advise against. I understand the risks, I interrupted gently. But this could connect to the financial irregularities we're investigating. I need to know what this person has to share. Thomas frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. At minimum, you should have backup nearby. I could position 2 plainclothes security officers within response distance. They wouldn't be visible, but could intervene if necessary. I considered the offer. Having backup would be prudent, but might also spook my potential informant. What about this? You monitor remotely from a security station, and I wear a discrete communication device. If I say a specific phrase, your team moves in immediately. He nodded slowly. That could work. We have earpieces that are nearly invisible. The signal won't reach the security office from that location, but I could monitor personally from a maintenance room on the same level. Perfect. I checked my watch. 4:45 p.m. Can we have everything in place by 5:30? Yes, ma'am. And he hesitated briefly. If I may make a suggestion, it might be wise to have a secondary exit strategy. There's a maintenance corridor that connects to the loading dock area. I can make sure it's unlocked. His thoroughness impressed me. You seem very prepared for this type of situation, Thomas. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 15 years with Army Special Forces teaches you to anticipate contingencies, ma'am. This explained both his composure and his apparent distaste for James. Military precision and integrity would naturally clash with James's casual relationship with rules and ethics. I'd like to know more about your background sometime, I said. But for now, let's focus on this meeting. After Thomas departed to make arrangements, I continued reviewing the financial documents Maria had provided, but my mind kept returning to the mysterious text. Who would have access to the Singapore files that I hadn't already seen? And what did they mean by not what you think? At 5:20, I locked my office and took the executive elevator down to the parking levels. Thomas had equipped me with a flesh-colored earpiece so discreet it was virtually invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. We had established a safety protocol. If I said definitely interesting, he would immediately send in the 2 security officers positioned nearby. Testing communication, Thomas's voice came through clearly in my ear as I exited the elevator on level B. Received, I murmured, adjusting my blazer. I'd intentionally left my usual heels behind in favor of more practical flats that would allow for quicker movement if necessary. My pepper spray was accessible in my jacket pocket, a habit I'd developed years ago when conducting field investigations in less secure locations. The parking garage was eerily quiet at this hour. Most employees had already departed for the day, leaving only scattered vehicles under the harsh fluorescent lighting. My footsteps echoed slightly as I made my way toward the south corner, passing concrete pillars adorned with fading yellow paint. Approaching the location now, I whispered. Any sign of anyone? Negative, Thomas replied. But there's a vehicle idling just outside the blind spot. Dark sedan, tinted windows, diplomatic plates. Diplomatic plates? That was unexpected and concerning. What connection could foreign interests possibly have to Bellamy's financial irregularities? As I rounded the final corner, the sedan came into view, positioned precisely where Thomas had indicated the camera blind spot would be. Its engine was running, but the headlights remained off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the rear door opened. "Stay where you are, please," came a woman's voice from within the vehicle. I'd prefer not to step out if possible. I stopped, maintaining enough distance to retreat if necessary. I came as requested. You said you have information about Singapore? Yes, the voice confirmed. But first, I need to know if you're wearing any recording devices or if you've brought anyone with you. I came alone, I replied truthfully, as Thomas and his security officers weren't technically with me. As for recording devices, I made a show of opening my purse to display its contents. No recorders, just my phone, which is powered off. There was a brief pause, then, "Good enough. Please approach the vehicle, but don't enter." I moved cautiously forward until I could see into the open door. The interior was dimly lit, but I could make out a woman in her 40s, immaculately dressed. In a charcoal suit, her face seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place her. "You don't recognize me," she stated rather than asked. "I'm Alexandra Keller, Deputy Finance Minister for the Republic of Singapore." The name clicked immediately. I had seen her in news coverage of international economic forums. "What's your interest in Bellamy's operations, Minister Keller?" "My interest is ensuring that my country's reputation isn't collateral damage in your husband's criminal enterprises," she replied sharply. "The Singapore Investment Authority has been investigating unusual capital flows through our financial system for the past 18 months. All trails led to Bellamy Industries, specifically to operations personally overseen by James Summers." "The Marston consulting payments," I suggested. She nodded. "Among others. But Marston is merely one node in a complex network. Your husband has been using Singapore's financial infrastructure to move funds between at least 7 different jurisdictions, obscuring both the origins and destinations of significant capital flows. Money laundering," I concluded. "On an impressive scale," she confirmed, "but with sophisticated structure that suggests he isn't acting alone. This operation has the hallmarks of professional financial architects with connection to—" She hesitated. "Entities we've encountered before." "What entities?" Instead of answering directly, she handed me a sealed envelope. "Everything we've compiled is in here. Account numbers, transaction dates, shell company structures. We're providing this to you rather than to American authorities directly because Singapore values its reputation for financial discretion. A public international investigation would damage that reputation." I accepted the envelope, noting its substantial weight. "Why now? And why me specifically?" Alexandra's expression hardened slightly. "Because the transactions have recently shifted toward patterns consistent with something more concerning than tax evasion or corporate fraud. Based on transaction recipients and timing, we believe Bellamy funds are being used to finance activities that could have national security implications." "What kind of activities?" "The kind that diplomatic courtesy prevents me from directly accusing an American corporation of supporting," she replied carefully. "But the documentation should make the connections clear, particularly regarding an entity referred to in internal communications as the Commissioner, the same title from the recorded meetings." My pulse quickened. "There's one more thing you should know," Alexandra added, her voice lowering. "Your appointment as CEO was not unexpected in certain circles. In fact, it appears some parties were counting on it." "What does that mean?" I asked, a chill running through me despite the garage's warmth. "It means you should trust no one completely, Ms. Summers, not even those who appear to be your allies." She reached for the door handle. "My contact information is in the envelope. If you discover something requiring immediate attention. Otherwise, I trust you'll use this information appropriately." As the door closed and the sedan pulled away, I stood motionless, processing the implications of this unexpected encounter. "Did you get all that?" I murmured to Thomas. "Yes, ma'am," his voice confirmed in my ear. "And I've taken the liberty of noting the vehicle's diplomatic registration." "Good. I'm heading back up. Meet me in my office in 15 minutes. And Thomas, let's keep this between us for now." "Understood." As I rode the elevator back to the executive floor, I contemplated Alexandra Keller's parting warning. My appointment as CEO had been expected in certain circles, even counted on. But why? What advantage could unknown parties possibly gain from my investigation into James's activities? The envelope in my hands suddenly felt heavier, as if weighted with implications beyond mere financial documents. Whatever game was being played, I had just become a piece on someone else's chessboard, and I needed to understand the full dimensions of that board before my next move. My office felt different as I spread Alexandra Keller's documents across the conference table, colder, more isolated, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the explosive information now laid bare before me. Thomas stood by the door, his military bearing providing an oddly reassuring presence amidst the chaos of revelations. "This is extensive," I murmured, organizing the papers into categories: financial transfers, corporate structures, communication, records, and a particularly disturbing section labeled simply Nexus Integration. "May I?" Thomas gestured toward the documents. I nodded, curious about his perspective. He studied the financial flowcharts with surprisingly professional attention, his finger tracing complex pathways between shell companies. "Classic layering technique," he observed, "used to distance the origin of funds from their ultimate destination through multiple jurisdictions. I saw similar structures during my military deployments tracking terrorist financing networks." I looked up sharply. "You have experience with financial intelligence?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 4 years embedded with Treasury's terrorist financing and financial crimes unit before transferring to private security. I recognize these patterns. This revelation shifted my perception of Thomas entirely. "And you ended up as head of security at Bellamy because after I flagged concerns about irregular financial patterns at my previous employer, I suddenly found myself unemployable in the financial sector." His expression hardened momentarily. "Until Eleanor Prescott personally recruited me for this position 3 years ago. Eleanor had hired him directly. This connection couldn't be coincidental. She knew about your background. She knew I wouldn't be easily intimidated or bought," he confirmed, though Mr. Summers tried both approaches repeatedly to have me removed. The pieces were beginning to align. Eleanor had been placing her own chess pieces on the board long before I entered the picture. "These transaction records," I indicated a specific section of the documents, "they show movements through accounts controlled by something called Prometheus Holdings. Any recognition of that name?" Thomas shook his head. "Not specifically, but the structure resembles a private military contractor laundering operation I encountered in Eastern Europe. Multiple shell companies, jurisdictional hopscotching, periodic consolidation through legitimate-appearing businesses." I sorted through more papers until I found what I was looking for: a comprehensive chart mapping the relationship between Bellamy Industries, the various shell companies, and their ultimate connections. At the top of this pyramid sat a single entity labeled Commissioner Operations. "There it is again," I whispered. "The Commissioner, but still no actual name attached." Thomas leaned closer. "Look at these payment destinations, though. Defense research labs, specialized equipment manufacturers, former military personnel with very specific skill sets." "What kind of skills?" "The kind you need for black operations: surveillance, infiltration, digital intrusion." His finger tapped a particular name. "This individual was dishonorably discharged from Delta Force for excessive force during an intelligence-gathering operation. He now works private security for entities willing to overlook his methods." The implications turned my blood cold. "You're suggesting Bellamy funds are being used to finance some kind of private military or intelligence operation?" "The evidence points in that direction," Thomas confirmed, though the ultimate purpose remains unclear. I continued examining the documents, focusing now on the communications section. Most were email excerpts, carefully redacted to protect the source, but still revealing disturbing patterns of conversation between James and various unnamed contacts. One exchange from approximately 9 months ago caught my attention. JS. Integration. Timeline confirmed. Acquisition framework in place pending board approval. No obstacles anticipated. Calm. Personal situation remains a concern. Potential conflict of interest through spouse's connections must be addressed before proceeding to Phase 2JS. Will handle appropriately after Singapore consolidation complete. Legal separation can be arranged with minimal disruption to operational timeline. Calm. See that it is. The Nexus acquisition cannot proceed with potential counterintelligence exposure through matrimonial discovery rights. I read the exchange 3 times, my hands growing colder with each pass. 9 months ago, James had already been planning our divorce. Not because of Veronica, but because my professional position created a counterintelligence exposure for whatever operation they were running. Thomas, I said slowly, I need to understand exactly what's happening here. These references to Nexus acquisition and integration, they're discussing the potential purchase of Nexus Biotech, correct? That's the public understanding. He replied carefully. Bellamy has been positioning for a takeover of Nexus for nearly 18 months. Their advanced pharmaceutical development division would complement Bellamy's medical technology platforms. But what if that's not the full picture? I spread out the Nexus integration documents. Look at these projections. They're not discussing market share or profit margins. They're mapping access points to something called Helios Protocol. Thomas stiffened visibly. Helios is a classified Defense Department initiative. It shouldn't appear in corporate acquisition documents. How do you know about it? He hesitated before answering. It was referenced in high-level security briefings during my time with Treasury. I don't know the specifics. My clearance wasn't high enough. But it involved next-generation biodefense research. The pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. So, Bellamy isn't just acquiring Nexus for its commercial potential. They're after access to classified defense research. It appears that way, Thomas agreed. And based on these documents, the commissioner is orchestrating the entire operation from behind multiple layers of corporate secrecy. I sat back, trying to process the scale of what we were uncovering. This went far beyond financial fraud or corporate malfeasance. James hadn't just been stealing from the company. He'd been redirecting resources toward some kind of military-industrial espionage operation with potentially serious national security implications. We need to contact federal authorities, I said finally. This is beyond corporate governance issues. Thomas nodded in agreement. But carefully, if these documents are accurate, the commissioner has connections within multiple agencies. Going through standard channels could alert them before proper investigation can be established. A soft knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Eleanor Prescott stood in the doorway, her expression grave. I see Thomas has filled you in on his background, she observed, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. Good. We'll need his expertise moving forward. You knew, I stated rather than asked. About James, about all of this. You've been tracking it. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening city skyline. Not all of it. Pieces, suspicions, patterns that didn't align with legitimate business operations. That's why I hired Thomas 3 years ago, to help me understand what was happening within my own company. And why you approached me 6 months ago when I came to you with concerns about the financial irregularities, I added. She turned to face me. You were the missing piece, Katherine. Someone with both the financial forensics background to understand the complexity of what James had constructed and the personal motivation to pursue it relentlessly. You used me, I said quietly, not accusatory but acknowledging the reality. I recruited you, she corrected gently, because you were uniquely qualified to help save this company from whatever James and his mysterious commissioner have planned. I gestured toward the scattered documents. This goes far beyond saving a company, Eleanor. We're looking at potential espionage, misappropriation of classified defense research, construction of what appears to be a private intelligence operation using corporate funds. Eleanor's expression didn't register surprise. only confirmation of her suspicions. Then we proceed carefully, but decisively. Katherine, as CEO, you have the authority to initiate a complete security lockdown of all systems and facilities. I suggest we begin there, before these documents disappear or servers are mysteriously corrupted. Already in progress, Thomas interjected. I've authorized emergency security protocols under the Cyber Attack Contingency Framework. All data systems are in preservation mode, and physical security has been enhanced at all facilities. I raised an eyebrow. On whose authority? On the authority of this, Eleanor removed a document from her portfolio and placed it before me. Emergency Executive Powers Authorization, signed by the board last year as a contingency measure. It grants the head of security expanded operational authority in the event of credible threats to company infrastructure or intellectual property. I scanned the document, noting the signatures of every board member, including James's. He signed this, knowing what Thomas might uncover? James never believed Thomas would find anything, Eleanor explained. He systematically underestimated anyone he considered beneath his social or professional status, a fatal flaw in his otherwise meticulous planning. The same flaw that had led him to underestimate me throughout our marriage, to believe I would simply accept his explanations, ignore the inconsistencies, never develop the skills to unravel his deceptions. His arrogance had become the instrument of his downfall. We need to move quickly, I decided, gathering the most critical documents. Thomas, secure these in whatever facility you consider most protected. Eleanor, we need to convene an emergency board meeting. Select members only, those you trust implicitly. And James? Thomas asked. I considered this carefully. For now, we maintain the administrative leave status. If he believes we're still focused on the financial fraud aspects, it gives us time to secure the evidence of these larger operations. As Thomas gathered the documents and Eleanor made calls to arrange the emergency board meeting, I found myself standing at the window, staring at my own reflection against the backdrop of city lights. 24 hours ago, I had walked into Bellamy Industries seeking personal vindication against a husband who had humiliated me. Now I stood at the center of something far larger and more dangerous, a conspiracy with national security implications that somehow, inexplicably, had placed me exactly where the commissioner had wanted me all along. The question that haunted me as night fell over the city was simple, but chilling. Why? The secure conference room 3 floors below the executive level had originally been designed for sensitive contract negotiations. With its electromagnetic shielding, signal-blocking architecture, and independent air system, it provided the ideal location for the emergency meeting I'd assembled. By 9:30 p.m., 7 people had gathered around the polished oak table. Myself, Eleanor Thomas, our Chief Legal Officer Patricia Winters, Head of Research Development Marcus Chen, Board Financial Director Caroline Okafor, and somewhat surprisingly, Maria. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, I began, surveying the faces before me. Each had been personally vetted by Eleanor or Thomas, trusted individuals who had demonstrated integrity in their respective roles, often at personal cost, to their advancement under James's leadership. I've asked Maria to join us because of her unique position as James's former assistant, I explained, acknowledging the questioning glances directed her way. She has direct knowledge of communications and meetings that never appeared in official records. Maria nodded nervously, clutching a leather portfolio like a shield. The transformation from James's intimidated assistant to potential whistleblower clearly weighed heavily on her. Before we proceed, Patricia interjected, I need to establish the legal parameters of this discussion. Are we operating under attorney-client privilege for this meeting? Yes, I confirmed. Everything discussed is privileged and confidential. We're dealing with matters that go beyond standard corporate governance issues. Thomas activated a small electronic device in the center of the table. Signal disruptor, he explained. Additional security against electronic eavesdropping, despite the room's shielding. I took a deep breath and began outlining what we had discovered, starting with the financial irregularities and systematically expanding to the disturbing connections revealed in Alexandra Keller's documents. As I spoke, Thomas displayed key evidence on the room's secure monitor, highlighting transaction patterns, communication records, and organizational structures that painted an increasingly alarming picture. So Bellamy funds were being systematically diverted to finance what appears to be a private intelligence operation, Caroline summarized, her financial expertise allowing her to quickly grasp the implications. And this operation is somehow connected to our planned acquisition of Nexus Biotech? Yes, I confirmed, but not for the commercial reasons stated in the official acquisition proposal. Based on these documents, the real target is access to classified biodefense research. Specifically, something called the Helios Protocol. Marcus Chen, who had remained silent until now, visibly paled. As our head of research development, he would have the most direct knowledge of Bellamy's scientific objectives. You recognize that name, I noted, watching his reaction carefully. Marcus glanced at Patricia, who nodded slightly before responding. Helios isn't just a protocol. It's potentially the most significant breakthrough in targeted immunotherapy of the last century. Nexus has been developing it under Defense Department. Contracts for specialized military applications. What kind of applications? Eleanor pressed. Marcus chose his words with scientific precision. Customized immunological responses to biological warfare agents. Essentially, a programmable immune system that can be rapidly adapted to counter any biological threat, natural or engineered. The implications settled heavily over the room. Technology of that nature would have extraordinary value, both commercially for legitimate medical applications and strategically for less benevolent purposes. But why would James be involved in this? Caroline asked. He's a financial executive, not a scientist or intelligence operative. Money, Patricia suggested. Technology this revolutionary would be worth billions on the legitimate market, potentially trillions if weaponized. I shook my head. This goes beyond simple profit motive. The communication records suggest a coordinated, long-term operation with specific strategic objectives, and the repeated references to the commissioner indicate a controlling influence outside standard corporate structures. I might have relevant information, Maria offered hesitantly, opening her portfolio. After our conversation earlier today, I went through my personal records of Mr. Summers' activities. 3 years ago, shortly after he was promoted to CEO, he began regular meetings with a man who never appeared in official visitor logs. The man would arrive after hours, often using the private garage entrance reserved for board members. Did you ever get a name? Thomas asked. He was only ever introduced to me as Commissioner Blackwood, Maria replied, retrieving a photograph from her portfolio. I took this from the security camera feed when I was helping Mr. Summers compile footage for a building security assessment. She placed the photograph on the table, a grainy but clear image of James shaking hands with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. Thomas studied the image intently. Former Assistant Director of Clandestine Operations at the CIA, Richard Blackwood. Officially retired 8 years ago after a distinguished 30-year career. You recognize him immediately? I observed. He was a legend in intelligence circles, Thomas explained. Orchestrated some of the most complex covert operations of the post-Cold War era. After retiring, he supposedly became a private defense consultant, but maintained deep connections throughout the intelligence community and military-industrial complex. The pieces were aligning with disturbing clarity. So, a former high-level CIA operative has been working with James to redirect Bellamy resources toward acquiring classified biodefense technology. The question is why, and for whom? I have a theory, Marcus said quietly, but it's troubling. Helios was originally conceived as a defensive technology, a way to protect soldiers from biological weapons. But its underlying mechanisms could theoretically be reversed. Meaning? Eleanor prompted. Instead of programming immunity to specific pathogens, the same technology could potentially be used to program vulnerability, to design biological agents that target specific genetic markers. His voice dropped further. In essence, customized biological weapons that could affect only selected populations with particular genetic profiles. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Weaponized, such technology could enable targeted biological warfare of unprecedented precision, ethnic-specific, gender-specific, even potentially targeting individuals with particular genetic traits. That can't possibly be what Bellamy is involved with, Caroline objected. We're a publicly traded medical technology company, not a weapons developer. Not Bellamy officially, I clarified, but a shadow operation using Bellamy's resources and position, directed by someone with extensive intelligence experience and global connections. Patricia leaned forward, her legal mind processing the ramifications. If true, this constitutes potential violations of international weapons conventions, corporate espionage, misappropriation of classified defense technology, securities fraud, on a massive scale, and possibly treason, which explains the extraordinary lengths taken to compartmentalize this operation, Thomas added. The multiple shell companies, the offshore accounts, the private communication channels. I turned to Maria. You mentioned Commissioner Blackwood began meeting with James 3 years ago. That timing seems significant. She nodded. It coincided with the initial exploratory discussions about a potential Nexus acquisition. Mr. Summers was tasked with evaluating financial synergies between the companies, which would have given him legitimate reasons to request detailed information about Nexus's research portfolio, Marcus realized, including classified projects under government contracts. And James's position as CEO provided the mechanism to create the financial infrastructure to support whatever operation Blackwood was orchestrating, Caroline added. The comprehensive nature of the conspiracy was becoming clear, a carefully constructed operation leveraging Bellamy's corporate position to gain access to revolutionary biotechnology with dual-use potential, orchestrated by a former intelligence operative with the expertise to exploit such technology through channels outside normal regulatory oversight. There's one more troubling aspect, Thomas said, bringing our attention back to the documents. These financial transfers suggest they've already built significant operational capacity, research facilities, specialized personnel, global distribution networks. Whatever they're planning isn't theoretical. The infrastructure already exists, which means we need to act immediately, I concluded. But carefully. If Blackwood has the connections his background suggests, standard whistleblowing protocols could be compromised. Patricia considered this challenge from a legal perspective. We need simultaneous disclosure to multiple oversight bodies, SEC, Defense Department, Justice Department, and possibly intelligence committees in Congress. A coordinated approach that prevents any single point of intervention. And we need to secure Bellamy against potential countermeasures, Thomas added. Once Blackwood realizes we've uncovered the operation, we should anticipate sophisticated efforts to destroy evidence, discredit witnesses, and potentially more direct interventions. More direct? Caroline questioned. Thomas's expression was grave. Someone with Blackwood's background wouldn't hesitate to employ extreme measures to protect an operation of this magnitude. We should assume our physical safety could be at risk. This sobering assessment shifted the atmosphere in the room. What had begun as a corporate investigation had evolved into something with life or death implications. I've taken the liberty of implementing preliminary protective measures, Thomas continued. Security details have been assigned to each of you, though discreetly. Your homes and personal communications are being monitored for suspicious activity, and secure accommodations have been arranged if needed. And James? I asked, suddenly realizing we hadn't addressed his current status. Under surveillance, Thomas confirmed. He's currently at the Madison Hotel, where he's made 17 phone calls in the past 4 hours, including 3 to unlisted numbers associated with shell companies identified in the Singapore documents. He's warning them, Eleanor concluded. Likely, Thomas agreed, but in a limited capacity. Based on documented security protocols in similar operations, James would only have partial knowledge of the broader infrastructure, enough to execute his portion, but with deliberate gaps to maintain operational security. I processed all this information, feeling the weight of responsibility settling more heavily with each revelation. What had begun as a personal mission to expose James's betrayal had evolved into something with potential national security implications, placing everyone in this room at considerable risk. We need to move tonight, I decided. Thomas will coordinate security measures and evidence preservation. Patricia, begin preparing the legal framework for simultaneous disclosure to appropriate authorities. Marcus, compile a comprehensive analysis of Helios technology and its potential applications, both legitimate and weaponized. Caroline, trace every financial connection to identify the full scope of the operation's resources. I turned to Eleanor. We need an emergency board meeting first thing tomorrow. Full board, in person, no remote participation. We'll need to disclose enough to secure their cooperation without revealing details that could compromise our investigation, if leaked. Finally, I addressed Maria. Your knowledge of James's communications and scheduling makes you particularly valuable and potentially vulnerable. Thomas will arrange secure accommodation for you tonight, and I'd like you to work with him to identify any additional contacts or resources James might activate. As the meeting concluded and assignments were distributed, I found myself momentarily alone with Eleanor. You've handled this remarkably well, she observed quietly. Most people would be overwhelmed by these revelations. I'm compartmentalizing, I admitted. The personal betrayal, the corporate fraud, and now this conspiracy. I can't process it all simultaneously and still function effectively. Eleanor nodded understanding. Just be prepared for James to escalate once he realizes the full extent of our investigation. A man like that, when cornered, becomes unpredictable. I'm counting on it, I replied, surprising myself with the cold calculation in my voice. His predictability has been his greatest vulnerability. His patterns, his arrogance, his underestimation of those he considers beneath him, they've exposed his operation more thoroughly than any deliberate investigation could have. As I gathered my materials to leave, I couldn't help wondering what James was doing at that moment, what desperate measures he might be contemplating as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. The husband I had once loved was now not just a faithless spouse or a corporate criminal, but potentially complicit in a conspiracy with global implications, and I had unwittingly become the greatest threat to whatever operation he had helped. Architect. The Madison Hotel's elegant lobby carried a veneer of normalcy as I passed through its revolving doors at 11:30 p.m., nodding politely to the overnight concierge who recognized me from previous charity events hosted in the hotel's ballroom. Thomas had strongly advised against this confrontation, but I overruled him with CEO authority that still felt foreign on my tongue. Some conversations needed to happen face-to-face. Mrs. Summers, the concierge greeted me, either unaware of or diplomatically ignoring the events of the past 24 hours. How lovely to see you. Are you joining Mr. Summers in the Magnolia Suite? Yes, I replied simply, accepting his direction toward the private elevators that served the hotel's exclusive upper floors. Thomas's security team had confirmed James's location, though I'd insisted they maintain their distance. This needed to be a private conversation, without the buffer of security or the formality of corporate settings. The elevator ascended silently, carrying me toward a confrontation that would be unlike any in our 12-year marriage. A conversation where all pretenses had been stripped away, where both of us finally understood the true measure of the other. I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped to accomplish. Information gathering, perhaps. Or maybe something more primal, the need to see his face when he realized how completely his schemes had unraveled. I knocked firmly on the suite door, hearing movement inside before James appeared, still dressed in his business clothes, though noticeably rumpled. His expression cycled rapidly through surprise, wariness, and finally settling into a calculated charm that had once seemed genuine to me. "Katherine," he said, making no move to open the door further. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" I countered. "You've made 17 phone calls in the past 4 hours, including 3 to companies connected to offshore accounts in Singapore. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the pattern?" His expression hardened as he realized the extent of my surveillance. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped back, opening the door. "You might as well come in. I assume your security detail is lurking somewhere nearby." The suite was luxurious but showed signs of James's agitated state, papers scattered across the dining table, multiple devices charging on various surfaces, a half-empty whiskey glass abandoned on the coffee table. "I came alone," I said, remaining standing despite his gesture toward a chair. "Though Thomas knows exactly where I am and what time to expect me back." James poured himself another finger of whiskey, not offering me one. "So, the loyal head of security has allied himself with the new regime. Unsurprising. He never approved of my management methods." "He disapproved of your criminal enterprise," I corrected. "As did Eleanor, which is why she recruited him specifically to monitor your activities." He absorbed this information with a slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication that I'd caught him by surprise. "Eleanor plays a longer game than I gave her credit for, but then so do you, apparently." "We've identified Commissioner Blackwood," I stated flatly, watching carefully for his reaction. "Former Assistant Director of Clandestine Operations, CIA. Currently operating a private intelligence network funded through Bellamy Resources and leveraging our planned acquisition of Nexus Biotech to access classified biodefense technology." The whiskey glass paused halfway to his lips, the only break in his carefully maintained composure. "That's quite a theory." "Not a theory. We have the Singapore financial records, the shell company structures, the communication logs, and the Nexus integration documents specifically targeting Helios protocol access." I moved closer, studying his face. "What I don't fully understand yet is why. What does Blackwood want with technology designed for immunological defense against biological weapons?" James drained his glass before responding. "You've assembled an impressive collection of fragments, Katherine, but you're missing the contextual framework to understand what you're seeing." "Then enlighten me." He considered me for a long moment, as if assessing whether I was worth bringing into his confidence. "The world is changing in ways most corporate leaders and politicians refuse to acknowledge. Conventional warfare is becoming obsolete. The next great conflicts will be biological, targeted, and deniable. Whoever controls the mechanisms to protect against or deploy such weapons will dictate the terms of global power for the next century. And Blackwood is positioning himself to be that controlling entity," I concluded, using Bellamy's resources and legitimacy as cover. "Not himself," James corrected. "He represents interests that transcend any individual. Strategic thinkers who understand what's coming and are preparing accordingly. By stealing classified defense technology and building the infrastructure to weaponize it outside governmental oversight," I clarified. "That's not strategic planning, James. It's a criminal conspiracy at best, treason at worst." He laughed, without humor. "Still thinking in such conventional categories. This operation exists in the spaces between traditional legal frameworks. It's not about criminality or treason. It's about preparation for inevitable global realities that existing institutions are too slow and compromised to address." The cold calculation in his voice chilled me. This wasn't just financial greed or corporate ambition. James had been radicalized into some form of apocalyptic thinking that justified extreme measures. "And your role?" I asked, genuinely curious, how he had rationalized his participation. Financial architect for doomsday preppers with advanced degrees? His expression hardened. Executive implementation. Blackwood provided the strategic vision and connections. I constructed the operational framework to execute that vision. The Nexus acquisition was my design, a perfectly legitimate corporate transaction that would grant access to technology otherwise locked behind classified barriers. Did you ever consider the human implications? I pressed. Marcus explained. What Helios could potentially become if weaponized. Targeted biological agents designed to affect specific genetic populations. You're helping build the infrastructure for what amounts to genetically selective genocide. Technological evolution always has dual applications, he replied dismissively. Nuclear physics gave us both power plants and atomic bombs. The Internet delivered both global communication and unprecedented surveillance. Helios will transform medicine regardless of its potential military applications. I studied the man before me. Physically the same person I had married 12 years ago, yet fundamentally unrecognizable in his moral framework. When did this start? When did you become involved with Blackwood? 3 years ago, he admitted, after a pause. Eleanor had recommended me for CEO, and during the transition process, I was approached about participating in a special initiative involving national security interests. Initially, it seemed like standard corporate cooperation. With intelligence agencies, the kind of back-channel relationship many large companies maintain. But it evolved. It became clear that Blackwood's operation existed outside official channels, a private initiative with connections to elements within intelligence communities, but not formally part of them. The compensation was extraordinary, and the professional opportunities unprecedented. And your conscience? He shrugged slightly. I compartmentalized. The financial architecture was intellectually challenging, the strategic objectives aligned with my understanding of global trends. And us? I asked, finally addressing the personal dimension. Where did I fit into this grand strategic vision? For the first time, James showed genuine discomfort. Initially, nowhere. Our marriage was separate from my professional activities. But as the operation expanded and your forensic finance career advanced, Blackwood identified a potential security, vulnerability, my potential access to financial records that might reveal the operation, I concluded. So our marriage became a liability to be eliminated. It was more complicated than that, he protested, though weakly. Your position at Vertex created potential conflicts of interest. If you were ever assigned to investigate transactions involving our partner institutions, so you planned our separation, I continued, the pieces fitting together with painful clarity. Scheduled it to coincide with the Nexus acquisition timeline. And Veronica was… what? A convenient justification? A calculated distraction from the real reasons? James had the decency to look somewhat ashamed. The relationship with Veronica developed naturally, but yes, its disclosure was timed to provide a plausible personal reason for our separation, avoiding any connection to my professional activities. And the anniversary dinner? The question emerged before I could suppress. It was the last remnant of personal hurt-seeking explanation. Poor judgment, he admitted. Blackwood suggested accelerating our separation, and I thought making it about Veronica would be cleaner than the complex legal negotiations a standard divorce would entail. The calculated cruelty of it, using our anniversary dinner as the venue for his performance, still had the power to wound despite everything else I'd discovered. But I pushed the personal pain aside, focusing on the larger implications. What happens now? I asked. You must realize, we've uncovered enough to dismantle this entire operation. By tomorrow morning, multiple federal agencies will be involved. James's expression shifted to something harder, more resolute. You've assembled impressive evidence, but you've underestimated the contingency planning built into this operation. Blackwood has spent decades constructing influence networks throughout government, intelligence services, and regulatory agencies. Standard reporting channels are compromised. Which is why we're not using standard channels, I countered. Simultaneous disclosure to multiple oversight bodies, with evidence packages already distributed to secure locations and trusted media contacts as insurance. For the first time, genuine concern flickered across his features. Katherine, listen to me carefully. This operation has protection mechanisms that operate outside legal frameworks. If Blackwood believes you represent an existential threat to the broader initiative, he won't hesitate to employ extreme countermeasures. Is that a threat? I asked calmly. A warning, he corrected urgently. From someone who still cares what happens to you despite everything. There are layers to this operation you haven't uncovered, resources you can't anticipate. Walk away. Take the CEO position. Implement your corporate reforms. Address the financial irregularities if you must, but leave the Blackwood connection and Helios technology alone. That's not an option, I said firmly. Not with what we now understand about the potential applications of this technology. James moved closer, lowering his voice despite the privacy of the suite. Then, at minimum, delay your disclosure for 72 hours. Give me time to negotiate a managed extraction for you. Immunity arrangements, relocation protocols, new identity if necessary. The desperation in his voice seemed genuine, which was perhaps the most disturbing element of our entire conversation. James truly believed the operation had the capacity and willingness to eliminate threats with lethal efficiency. I appreciate the warning, I said carefully, but contingency measures are already in place. Thomas has implemented security protocols based on his counterterrorism experience, and Patricia has structured the disclosure mechanism to be triggered automatically if any of us are compromised. James closed his eyes briefly, resignation settling across his features. Then there's nothing more I can do. When you leave here, I'll be contacting Blackwood to inform him of the breach. Not out of loyalty to the operation, but because if I don't, he'll assume I've defected. That would trigger protocols even more dangerous than what you're already facing. I understand, I said, and surprisingly I did. Despite everything, I didn't wish James dead, merely held accountable for his actions. What will you do? Implement. My own extraction plan, he replied with a ghost of his former confidence. Contingency measures I established without Blackwood's knowledge. By this time tomorrow, I'll be beyond reach of both federal authorities and Blackwood's operatives. Running, I observed. After everything you've done, all the lives you've potentially endangered, you're simply walking away. Surviving, he corrected. A skill you should focus on yourself in the coming days. As I turned to leave, James called after me. Katherine, for what it's worth, not everything was a lie. There were years when what we had was real, before all of this began. I paused at the door, considering his words. Perhaps. But we'll never know now, will we? You sacrificed whatever was genuine between us for your strategic vision. I hope it was worth it. Without waiting for his response, I walked out, closing the door firmly behind me. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I sent a text to Thomas confirming my safety and requesting the security detail to escort me back to Bellamy headquarters. The confrontation with James had provided valuable confirmation of our theories, but more importantly, it had severed the last emotional tether connecting me to the man I had married. Whatever happened next, whether we succeeded in exposing the operation or faced the countermeasures James had warned about, I would face it with clarity unclouded by lingering personal attachments. James had made his choices, aligning himself with forces that viewed human lives as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of strategic objectives. I had made mine, standing against such calculated inhumanity regardless of the personal cost. The true irony, which James had failed to recognize, was that his betrayal had created precisely the adversary the operation most feared, someone with both the knowledge to understand their methods and the moral clarity to oppose them without reservation. By bringing his mistress to our anniversary dinner, he hadn't just ended our marriage. He had catalyzed the formation of his most dangerous opponent. Thomas was waiting with the security detail when I emerged from the Madison Hotel. His expression, a careful mask of professional neutrality that didn't quite conceal his concern. "Everything go as expected?" he asked, opening the door to the armored SUV that would return us to Bellamy headquarters. He confirmed our suspicions about Blackwood and the broader operation, I replied, sliding into the vehicle. And provided additional context about their strategic objectives. He's also planning to contact Blackwood immediately to report the breach. Thomas nodded grimly as he took the seat beside me. Expected, but it accelerates our timeline. We'll need to implement full countermeasures now. As the SUV pulled away from the hotel, I noticed 2 additional vehicles falling into formation, one ahead, one behind. Thomas had clearly upgraded security protocols while I was meeting with James. "Status update," I requested, compartmentalizing my personal feelings about the confrontation with James to focus on operational necessities. "Evidence packages are prepared and secured at 5 different locations," Thomas reported. "Patricia has completed the legal framework for simultaneous disclosure to Justice Department, Defense Department, SEC, and 2 congressional committees. Automated triggers are in place if any team member fails to check in according to schedule. And our people. Eleanor is at a secure location outside the city with Caroline, compiling the financial evidence. Marcus is working with a trusted colleague to document the technical aspects of Helios technology, specifically the dual-use capabilities that constitute the greatest concern. Maria is under protection at a monitored safe house, continuing to compile James's meeting records and communications. The methodical preparation was reassuring, though I couldn't shake the unease James's warning had instilled. If Blackwood had the connections and resources James described, we were potentially facing opposition from elements within the very agencies we needed to trust for protection. "What about Blackwood himself? Any movement?" I asked. "Nothing yet, but we've established surveillance on his known residences and business locations. The difficulty is that a man with his background knows how to operate without creating detectable patterns." The city streets glided past outside the SUV's tinted windows, the normal late-night traffic completely disconnected from the extraordinary circumstances unfolding within our vehicle. Pedestrians returning from restaurants, taxi drivers changing shifts, hotel doormen assisting late arrivals, all proceeding with their routines while we strategized against a conspiracy with potentially global implications. "James believes we're underestimating their counter-response capabilities," I said. He seemed genuinely concerned about potential extreme measures if Blackwood feels cornered. Thomas's expression hardened. Blackwood's operational history supports that concern. During his CIA tenure, he was known for aggressive preemptive action against perceived threats. Since transitioning to private operations, he's presumably operating without even the limited oversight that existed within the agency, which means we should anticipate sophisticated surveillance, potential infiltration of our security systems, and possibly direct intervention if other measures fail. His assessment was clinical, detached, the analysis of a professional rather than alarmist speculation. "You've faced situations like this before," I observed. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Not exactly like this, but similar dynamics. Asymmetric resources, opponents with institutional advantages, high-stakes outcomes. And how did those situations resolve? Through preparation, unpredictability, and completely committing to the chosen course of action." He turned to face me directly. "The most dangerous moment in any operation is when key participants begin to doubt or hesitate. Blackwood will be counting on that, creating pressure points that test our resolve." The SUV turned into Bellamy's underground parking structure, passing through 3 security checkpoints before reaching the executive level. As we exited the vehicle, I noticed the increased security presence, uniformed guards at key access, points, plainclothes personnel monitoring surveillance feeds, enhanced identity verification procedures. The building's secure? I asked as we entered the private elevator. As secure as we can make it on short notice, Thomas confirmed. I've implemented protocols from my counterterrorism days: independent power systems, communication redundancies, multiple evacuation routes. The executive floor has been converted to our operations center, with dedicated security teams rotating in 4-hour shifts. The elevator opened directly onto what had previously been Bellamy's executive level, but now resembled a military command center. Workstations had been established throughout the open area, each focused on specific aspects of our response: legal coordination, financial tracking, technical analysis, security monitoring. Staff moved purposefully between stations, their faces reflecting the gravity of our operation without succumbing to panic. Patricia approached immediately, tablet in hand. We've received confirmation from our Justice Department contact. They've assigned a special task force from their National Security Division to receive our disclosure package tomorrow morning. The team will include representatives from FBI Counterintelligence and the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Trustworthy? Thomas asked, the question reflecting our shared concern about Blackwood's potential influence within federal agencies. As much as possible, Patricia confirmed. I worked directly with the task force leader during the Medicor Technologies prosecution 3 years ago. She has a reputation for absolute integrity and has previously investigated cases involving potential intelligence community overreach. This was modestly reassuring, though I remained conscious of James's warning about Blackwood's extensive influence network. What about the congressional committees? Both chairs have agreed to emergency closed sessions beginning at 10 a.m. Our disclosure packages will be delivered simultaneously to their secure committee rooms, with summary briefings conducted by trusted intermediaries with appropriate security clearances. The comprehensive preparation reflected Patricia's legal precision and Thomas's security expertise, creating multiple independent channels through which our evidence would flow, a deliberately redundant system designed to withstand potential interference at any single point. Katherine. Eleanor's voice drew my attention to the main conference room, where she stood surrounded by financial documents spread across the expansive table. We've uncovered something significant. I joined her at the table, examining the complex financial flowchart she had assembled. What am I looking at? Funding sources, she explained, indicating a series of transactions originating from numbered accounts across multiple jurisdictions. We assumed Blackwood was diverting Bellamy resources to fund his operation, but that's only partially correct. These transaction records show substantial external capital infusions from sources deliberately obscured through sophisticated laundering mechanisms. Meaning Blackwood isn't operating independently or simply appropriating corporate resources. He has substantial external backing, someone with access to hundreds of millions in liquid capital who shares his strategic objectives. This revelation added another disturbing dimension to an already complex situation. Can we identify the sources? Caroline joined us, pointing to specific transaction patterns. We've traced some flows to sovereign wealth funds operating through Swiss intermediaries, others to private family offices in Singapore and Abu Dhabi. But the most interesting pattern involves a series of transactions originating from accounts associated with Nexus Biotech's founder Lawrence Reynolds. Reynolds is involved? The connection was unexpected and troubling. Reynolds had founded Nexus 30 years ago, building it from a small research operation into a pharmaceutical powerhouse before stepping back from day-to-day operations 5 years ago. His continued involvement as chairman emeritus was largely ceremonial, or so industry analysts believed. It appears so, Caroline confirmed. These transactions suggest Reynolds has been quietly funding Blackwood's operation for at least 4 years, predating James's involvement, which raises questions about whether the Nexus acquisition was Blackwood's initiative as James suggested, or part of Reynolds's longer-term strategy. The implications were significant. If Reynolds was a principal architect rather than just another corporate executive being manipulated by Blackwood, the conspiracy had deeper roots and potentially greater resources than we had initially assessed. "Does this change our approach?" I asked, looking between Eleanor and Patricia. Patricia considered the new information carefully. "It broadens the scope of our disclosure. Reynolds has political connections that Blackwood lacks. Major campaign contributions to key committee chairs, a presidential appointment to the Science Advisory Board, philanthropic relationships with influential academic institutions. His involvement potentially complicates the reception of our evidence, but also makes it more crucial that we proceed," Eleanor added firmly. "If someone with Reynolds's resources and connections is pursuing weaponized applications of Helios, technology outside governmental oversight, the potential consequences are even more severe." Thomas, who had been monitoring security feeds while listening to our discussion, approached with renewed urgency. "We have movement. Blackwood's private jet filed a flight plan for immediate departure to Geneva, and James just left the Madison Hotel accompanied by 2 individuals matching the description of Blackwood's security personnel." "James said he had his own extraction plan," I noted. "Apparently, it involved coordination with Blackwood despite his claims of operating independently. Or, Blackwood is ensuring James doesn't become a liability," Thomas suggested more ominously. "Either way, they're accelerating their response to our investigation. We should assume they're implementing whatever countermeasures James warned about." As if confirming his assessment, the building's security system registered a perimeter alert. Thomas immediately moved to the monitoring station, barking orders to security teams while reviewing camera feeds. 3 vehicles approaching the executive parking entrance, he reported. "No scheduled deliveries or approved visitors at this hour." "Corporate security?" I suggested, though with limited hope. "Not using appropriate protocols or identification," Thomas replied grimly. "And the vehicle configuration matches standard tactical approach formations." The implications were clear. Blackwood was moving against us directly, hoping to neutralize our operation before the morning disclosure could proceed. The theoretical threat James had warned about was materializing with alarming speed. "Evacuation Protocol Alpha," Thomas ordered, activating building-wide security measures. "All personnel to designated safe locations according to the established plan. Priority protection for primary disclosure team members." The operations center erupted into controlled urgency, not panic, but purposeful action as team members secured evidence, wiped digital systems, and moved toward predetermined evacuation routes. Thomas approached me directly, his expression leaving no room for debate. "We need to move you immediately. The helicopter is standing by on the roof for primary team extraction. Secondary teams will disperse through ground routes to maintain disclosure capability, even if the primary team is compromised." As security personnel surrounded me, guiding me toward the executive elevator that would access the roof, I caught a final glimpse of the operations center's main monitor, thermal, imaging showing multiple figures advancing through the building's lower levels, moving with the coordinated precision of professional operatives. "They're inside already," I noted with alarm. "Expected," Thomas replied calmly. "The evacuation plan anticipates internal breach. That's why we maintained this position only long enough to finalize preparations, not as a defensive stronghold." The elevator ascended swiftly to the roof level, where the company helicopter waited with rotors already spinning, its powerful downdraft creating artificial wind across the helipad. As we approached, I saw Eleanor, Patricia, and Caroline already aboard, surrounded by additional security personnel. "Marcus?" I asked, noting his absence. "Separate extraction route," Thomas explained as he guided me into the helicopter. "Operational security, distributing key personnel across multiple evacuation methods to ensure redundancy." As the helicopter lifted from the helipad, banking sharply away from Bellamy headquarters, I looked back at the gleaming tower that had been the center of this extraordinary conflict. From this vantage point, it appeared unchanged. Another illuminated corporate monument against the night sky, giving no external indication of the drama unfolding within its walls. 24 hours earlier, I had entered that building as the betrayed wife seeking corporate revenge against an unfaithful husband. Now I was leaving as the central figure in a conspiracy investigation with national security implications, evacuating under armed protection while professional operatives breached the building's security perimeter. The transformation seemed almost incomprehensible in its scope and speed, yet it had been building for years beneath the surface of my marriage and James's corporate machinations, a hidden reality finally exposed by his fatal mistake of bringing Veronica to our anniversary dinner. That single act of casual cruelty had triggered a cascade of revelations that now threatened an entire clandestine operation years in the making. As the helicopter gained altitude, Thomas handed me a secure satellite phone. "We're proceeding to the primary safe location. From there, we'll coordinate with federal authorities for the morning disclosure process. Once that's initiated, protective custody protocols will be implemented for all key witnesses." I accepted the phone, suddenly conscious of the weight of responsibility resting on our successful evacuation and subsequent disclosure. What had begun as personal vindication had evolved into something far more significant, a potential intervention against technology that, weaponized, could threaten targeted populations globally. "And James?" I asked, the question emerging despite my determination to focus solely on operational considerations. Thomas's expression revealed nothing. Under surveillance as long as possible, his movements could provide additional intelligence about Blackwood's contingency plans and potential targets for counter-investigation. As the helicopter banked again, setting course for our undisclosed destination, I found myself reflecting on James's final words at the Madison, his claim that parts of our marriage had been genuine before Blackwood's operation began. Perhaps there was truth in that assertion, but whatever authentic connection we might once have shared had been sacrificed to his alignment with forces that viewed human lives as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of strategic advantage. That fundamental moral divergence, more than his affair with Veronica or even his financial crimes, had rendered any reconciliation impossible. In bringing his mistress to our anniversary dinner, James hadn't just ended our marriage. He had inadvertently exposed a conspiracy that might otherwise have remained hidden until its terrible potential was fully realized. The helicopter descended toward a sprawling rural compound approximately 60 miles outside the city, its lights extinguished for the final approach. Through the darkness, I could make out the silhouettes of multiple buildings arranged around a central courtyard, surrounded by dense forest that provided natural concealment from aerial surveillance. "Blackwood Ranch," Thomas explained, noting my questioning glance. "One of Eleanor's personal properties, purchased through a family trust with no connection to Bellamy Industries. No corporate records, no digital footprint, no reason for Blackwood's team to connect it to our operation." As the helicopter settled onto a concrete pad partially concealed by a retractable roof structure, I observed the sophisticated security measures already in place. Thermal imaging cameras mounted at strategic points, motion sensors throughout, the surrounding wooded perimeter, armed personnel maintaining discrete positions around the property. "You've been preparing this location for some time," I noted, impressed by the level of readiness. Eleanor nodded as we disembarked. After discovering the first indications of James's irregular activities, I began establishing contingency measures. This property has been equipped as an operational center for precisely this scenario. The main building's interior belied its rustic exterior, revealing a state-of-the-art command center with advanced communication systems, multiple workstations, and secure server infrastructure. Teams were already in position, monitoring news, feeds, surveillance networks, and secure communication channels. "Status report," Thomas requested as we entered, directing his question to a stern-looking woman coordinating the security team. All secondary evacuation teams have reported successful extraction and are proceeding to designated safe locations, she replied efficiently. Marcus Chen and his technical team have established secure uplink from location Charlie and are finalizing the technical documentation package. Maria is secure at location Echo with full protective detail. The breach team at Bellamy headquarters appears to be conducting a systematic search rather than pursuing specific targets, suggesting they're unsure of our evacuation protocols. And the disclosure packages? Patricia asked, immediately focusing on our primary objective. Secured and ready for delivery at 800 hours via multiple redundant channels, the coordinator confirmed. Confirmation protocols have been established with receiving agencies, with authentication measures to prevent interception or substitution. The comprehensive preparation was reassuring, though I remained conscious of the resources Blackwood could potentially marshal against us. What about James and Blackwood? Thomas gestured toward a dedicated monitoring station where satellite imagery and transportation tracking data were displayed. James's phone signal is currently stationary at Reagan National Airport, private. Aviation terminal. Blackwood's jet filed a flight plan for Geneva but actually departed for a private airfield in West Virginia. We're tracking both through secondary means, avoiding official systems that might be compromised. They're separating, I observed. James mentioned having his own extraction plan independent of Blackwood's operation. Or, Blackwood is implementing compartmentalized evacuation protocols, Thomas suggested. Standard procedure would be to separate key personnel during crisis response, reducing vulnerability through dispersal. Eleanor joined us at the monitoring station, studying the real-time tracking data. The more immediate concern is identifying any additional operational elements Blackwood might activate against us before the disclosure is complete. James implied significant counter-response capabilities. We've identified 3 private security contractors with known connections to Blackwood's previous operations, Thomas replied, bringing up personnel files on an adjacent screen. All former special operations with extensive experience in asset recovery and counterintelligence. We're monitoring their movement patterns and known associates. As the teams continued their methodical preparation for morning disclosure, I found myself momentarily at a remove from the operational details, struck by the extraordinary transformation of the past 24 hours. The personal betrayal that had initiated this cascade of events now seemed almost trivial compared to the broader conspiracy we had uncovered. Yet without that betrayal, Blackwood's operation might have proceeded unchallenged. You should rest. While you can, Eleanor suggested, noticing my momentary abstraction. The guest quarters are secure, and will need you focused for tomorrow's disclosure process. Federal authorities will want direct testimony from you as acting CEO. Rest seemed impossible given the circumstances, but I recognized the wisdom in her advice. The coming day would require absolute clarity and composure, particularly when explaining the complex financial infrastructure James had constructed to support Blackwood's operation. The guest quarters were Spartan but functional, clearly designed for security rather than comfort, with reinforced doors, shuttered windows, and emergency communication systems. As I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. Thomas had provided secure devices for essential communications, with strict protocols about usage. The message was from a blocked number. I can prove Blackwood isn't operating alone. This goes higher than you realize. South Parking Structure, General Hospital, 5 a.m. Come alone or not at all. My immediate instinct was to alert Thomas, but something in the message's phrasing gave me pause. The location, a public hospital with constant activity even at early hours, suggested someone who understood security considerations but wanted minimal risk of confrontation. The timing, just hours before our scheduled disclosure, indicated urgency rather than attempted disruption. After careful consideration, I decided to share the message with Thomas while withholding my intuition about its potential legitimacy. His response was predictably absolute. Obvious trap, he stated flatly after reading the message. Classic attempt to isolate a high-value target from security protocols. We should trace the origin and incorporate into our threat assessment. Agreed, I replied, maintaining a neutral expression while internally considering alternatives. If the message was genuine, if someone with insider knowledge was attempting to provide additional information about Blackwood's operation, ignoring it could mean missing critical intelligence before our disclosure. The challenge would be determining its authenticity without compromising our security. As Thomas worked with the technical team to analyze the message origin, I retreated to the guest quarters, ostensibly to rest, but actually to consider my options. The secure location was approximately 40 minutes from General Hospital by car. The rotation of security personnel created a predictable pattern of movement around the compound perimeter. And most importantly, Thomas had shown me the contingency evacuation routes during our initial briefing, including a maintenance access point at the rear of the property that bypassed the main security checkpoints. The rational decision was clear: remain within the security protocols established by professionals with relevant experience. Yet I couldn't shake the conviction that the message contained legitimate information essential to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy we faced. After years of financial forensics work, I had developed an instinct for distinguishing genuine whistleblowers from deception attempts. By 3:30 a.m., I had made my decision. Using the emergency medical kit in my quarters to simulate illness, I requested privacy while supposedly dealing with a migraine, a condition documented in my medical history that would raise minimal suspicion. Once alone, I used the maintenance access route identified during the security briefing, timing my movement between perimeter patrol rotations. A service vehicle, intended for emergency evacuation, was parked in a small garage connected to the maintenance building. The keys were secured in a lockbox with a simple combination that had been included in our emergency briefing. Within minutes, I was driving along the property's service road toward the highway, my secure phone deliberately left behind to prevent tracking. The decision was professionally indefensible, but intuitively compelling. If the message was indeed a trap, I had compromised not just my personal safety, but potentially the entire disclosure operation. If genuine, however, it might provide critical context about Blackwood's operation that could prove essential to successful intervention by federal authorities. The hospital parking structure was nearly empty at that hour, with only scattered vehicles belonging to overnight staff. I parked near the central elevator bank, positioning my vehicle for quick departure while maintaining clear sightlines in all directions. The defensive driving and situational awareness techniques I'd learned during my financial forensics career seemed inadequately matched against potential professional operatives, but they provided some measure of preparation. At precisely 5 a.m., a sedan with government plates pulled into the parking space 3 slots from mine. A woman in her 50s emerged, silver-haired, wearing a conservative pantsuit that suggested federal employment. She carried no visible weapon and made a deliberate show of keeping her hands visible as she approached. "Ms. Summers," she greeted me with a slight nod. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the dramatic approach, but conventional channels are compromised." "Who are you?" I remained behind my vehicle's open door, maintaining a barrier between us. "Andrea. Winters Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence Agency, Special Activities Division." She produced identification, holding it at a distance that allowed verification without closing the gap between us. "I've been tracking Blackwood's operation for 14 months as part of a classified counterintelligence assessment. The identification appeared authentic, though that provided limited reassurance given the resources potentially arrayed against us. Why contact me directly rather than coordinating with federal authorities receiving our disclosure? Because your disclosure, while detailed regarding Bellamy's financial involvement, lacks critical context about the broader operation." She glanced at her watch. "We have approximately 12 minutes before my absence from scheduled activities. Triggers automated protocols. Are you willing to receive this information?" The practiced efficiency of her approach suggested legitimacy. though caution remained paramount. "I'm listening." "Blackwood isn't the architect of this operation. He's middle management." She removed a small data drive from her jacket. This contains surveillance documentation establishing that he reports to a committee of private interests operating under the designation Prometheus Directive. The committee includes 3 former cabinet secretaries, a retired Supreme Allied, Commander Europe, and 2 individuals with direct access to current National Security Council deliberations. The implications of Andrea Winters' statement were staggering. If accurate, Blackwood's operation wasn't merely a rogue initiative by a former intelligence operative. It was a coordinated effort by individuals with substantial institutional power and current governmental access. "Prometheus Directive?" I repeated, accepting the data drive with cautious hands. "What's their objective beyond acquiring Helios technology?" "Strategic biological superiority," she replied, her voice clinical despite the horrifying concept. "The committee believes conventional military dominance is becoming obsolete. They're positioning for what they see as the inevitable next phase of global power competition. Selective biological targeting capabilities paired with genetic immunological protection for preferred populations. That's..." I struggled to find adequate words. "Genocide rebranded as strategic necessity," she finished grimly. "Cloaked in the language of national security and preparedness, but fundamentally an attempt to create biological leverage over geopolitical rivals. And the government agencies you represent are opposed to this?" Her expression tightened. "Elements within legitimate intelligence structures are monitoring and documenting these activities. Other elements are willfully ignorant or actively supportive. The institutional firebreaks that should prevent such operations have been systematically compromised through budget mechanisms, personnel appointments, and classification barriers." This fragmentation explained the elaborate precautions surrounding our meeting. "How does this affect our disclosure strategy?" "Your planned disclosure through Justice Department channels will activate automatic classification protocols once the connection to defense technology is recognized," she explained. "Those protocols can be manipulated to contain and eventually neutralize your evidence before it reaches appropriate oversight authorities." "We've established redundant disclosure paths," I countered. "Congressional committees, regulatory agencies, secured evidence packages with multiple triggers. All subject to intervention through legitimate classification authority." She glanced at her watch again. "The data drive contains verified channels for disclosure that bypass compromised systems. Specific individuals within oversight structures who maintain secure communications independent of standard protocols." The assertion was simultaneously reassuring and alarming. If Andrea Winters was genuine, she offered critical pathways to ensure our evidence reached appropriate authorities. If she was part of Blackwood's counter-response, accepting her guidance could divert our disclosure into channels designed to neutralize it. "Why should I trust you?" I asked directly. "You shouldn't," she replied with unexpected candor. "Verify independently. The drive includes authentication methods for each contact, personal history details that can be confirmed, operational patterns that establish legitimacy. Each verification step is compartmentalized to prevent comprehensive compromise." Her approach reflected sophisticated counterintelligence methodology, the careful construction of verification mechanisms that allowed cautious trust building without creating systemic vulnerabilities. It suggested legitimacy, though absolute certainty remained impossible under the circumstances. "I need to return now," she continued, already moving toward her vehicle. "Review the material with your security advisors but maintain strict informational hygiene. The Prometheus Committee has surveillance capabilities within standard federal communication systems, including those you'd typically consider secure." "Wait," I called after her. "James Summers, my husband, how deeply is he involved?" She paused briefly. "Initially, he was merely a financial architect with no knowledge of the operation's ultimate objectives." That changed approximately 8 months ago when he was elevated to partial briefing status. He knows the Helios applications are dual use, but hasn't been privy to the complete strategic framework or committee composition. This aligned with James's behavior during our confrontation at the Madison. His warnings carried the urgency of someone who understood the dangerous capabilities of the operation without comprehending its full dimensions, and Blackwood's current status. Implementing distributed evacuation protocols for key operational assets. Your discovery accelerated their timeline, but contingency preparations were already in place. Her expression softened momentarily. You've disrupted a carefully constructed operation, Ms. Summers, but these people have been planning for decades. They won't simply abandon their objectives because of exposure risk. With that sobering assessment, she entered her vehicle and departed, leaving me alone in the pre-dawn darkness of the parking structure with a data drive that potentially contained critical intelligence, or elaborate misinformation designed to compromise our disclosure strategy. The return journey to Blackwood Ranch was tense but uneventful, though I recognized the tremendous risk I had taken in leaving secure protection. Approaching the maintenance access point, I was unsurprised to find Thomas waiting, his expression a masterclass in controlled fury. You compromised operational security, potentially exposed our location through tracking, and risked the entire disclosure process, he stated flatly as I exited the vehicle. Give me one reason I shouldn't implement complete isolation protocols and remove you from operational decision-making. Instead of responding verbally, I handed him the data drive. Defense Intelligence Agency, Special Activities Division. Deputy Director Andrea Winters. Verification protocols included. His expression shifted from anger to intensely focused concern. You made contact with a purported intelligence official without security vetting or communication monitoring. The message suggested legitimate operational security concerns regarding standard protocols, I replied, maintaining composure despite recognition of my procedural violations. The information provided indicates a significant expansion of our understanding regarding Blackwood's operation and appropriate disclosure channels. Thomas studied the data drive with professional suspicion. This will need to be scanned on an isolated system before access, and you'll need to provide a complete debrief regarding the contact protocols, communication methods, and specific claims made by this alleged deputy director. Back inside the compound's operations center, Eleanor was waiting, her expression reflecting both relief at my return and concern over the security breach. You took an extraordinary risk, she said quietly. Thomas was preparing a complete relocation of all disclosure teams when the perimeter sensors registered your return. I apologize for the protocol violation, I acknowledged. The potential intelligence value presented a compelling case for controlled risk acceptance. Eleanor exchanged glances with Thomas. Let's assess that intelligence before making further judgments. The isolated system is ready in the secure analysis room. The next hour was devoted to careful examination of Andrea Winters' data drive, conducted on a computer system physically disconnected from any network. The contents were methodically scanned for embedded tracking software, malicious code, or other technical compromises before the actual intelligence was evaluated. What emerged was a comprehensive documentation of the Prometheus directive structure, operational methodologies, and strategic objectives, far more detailed than our existing intelligence about Blackwood's activities. Surveillance photographs showed committee meetings at secure private estates. Transcripts detailed strategic discussions about Helios technology applications, and organizational charts mapped influence networks extending through multiple government agencies. Most critically, the drive contained specific verification protocols for trusted disclosure recipients, senior officials in oversight positions who maintained secure communication channels independent of potentially compromised systems. Each contact included personalized authentication phrases and meeting protocols designed to confirm legitimacy while minimizing surveillance risk. This appears genuine, Thomas acknowledged reluctantly after thorough review. The operational documentation uses current counterintelligence methodologies, consistent with DIA special activities protocols. The personnel files on committee members contain details not available through public sources, but verifiable through historical records. Eleanor studied the organizational charts with growing concern. If accurate, this suggests institutional compromise at levels that would render standard whistleblower protections inadequate. Our disclosure strategy will need significant modification. That was my assessment as well, I agreed. The authentication protocols for these alternative disclosure channels are our best option for ensuring the evidence reaches appropriate oversight authorities. Thomas remained professionally skeptical. Assuming this intelligence is genuine, and that remains a significant assumption, implementing these alternative protocols would require substantial deviation from our established disclosure plan less than 2 hours before execution. The risk calculation has shifted, I noted. If standard disclosure channels are compromised, as this intelligence suggests, proceeding with our original plan could result in evidence containment before effective intervention occurs. Eleanor considered this carefully before making her decision. We'll implement a hybrid approach, maintain the original disclosure timeline through established channels, but simultaneously activate these alternative pathways as a redundancy measure. If the intelligence is legitimate, we've ensured effective disclosure. If compromised, our original strategy remains intact. Thomas nodded agreement, though his expression reflected continuing concern about operational security. I'll establish modified delivery protocols for the alternative channels, maintaining our original schedule for standard disclosures. However, he added with pointed emphasis toward me, all future operational decisions will follow established security protocols without exception. Another unauthorized departure would trigger immediate protective isolation. The rebuke was warranted, and I accepted it with professional equanimity. Despite the apparent intelligence value obtained, my unilateral action had created significant operational risk and violated the trust of the team working to ensure successful disclosure. As dawn approached, the compound's activity intensified, with teams preparing for the coordinated 8 a.m. disclosure through multiple channels. The evidence packages, documenting Blackwood's operation, the financial infrastructure James had constructed, and the potential weaponization of Helios technology, were secured for delivery through both standard protocols and the alternative channels identified in Andrea Winter's intelligence. At 7:15 a.m., our communications monitoring team detected a significant development. Blackwood's jet has suddenly changed course, the team leader reported. Originally tracking toward the private airfield in West Virginia, now heading back toward Reagan National. Landing clearance requested under diplomatic courtesy protocols. And, James? I asked, recognizing the strategic implications of this course change. Still at Reagan National, private aviation terminal, no departure filed. Thomas immediately grasped the significance. They're aborting dispersal. Something has triggered a strategic reassessment. Our disclosure timeline may have been compromised, Eleanor suggested. They could have surveillance on the federal officials scheduled to receive our evidence packages. Or they've detected our communication with alternative channels, Thomas added grimly. If Winter's intelligence is genuine, the Prometheus Committee would have monitoring capabilities that could identify preparation for non-standard disclosure. The implications were disturbing but clear. We needed to accelerate our disclosure schedule before Blackwood and his backers could implement countermeasures. Eleanor made the decision immediately. Initiate disclosure operations now, all channels, simultaneously. We can't risk waiting for the scheduled timeline if they're mobilizing response assets. Teams moved with practiced efficiency, initiating secure communications with both standard recipients and the alternative channels identified in Winter's intelligence. Evidence packages were transmitted digitally through encrypted connections, while physical documents were dispatched via security couriers already positioned near delivery locations. As the disclosure operation accelerated, Thomas approached with updated intelligence. We've confirmed through secondary verification that Andrea Winters is indeed Deputy Director of DIA Special Activities Division. Her electronic signature on departmental communications matches the authorization codes provided on the data drive. This confirmation substantially increased confidence in the alternative disclosure channels, though operational security remained at maximum alert. The next hour would determine whether our evidence reached appropriate authorities with sufficient impact to trigger official intervention against Blackwood's operation. At 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes ahead of our original schedule, the first confirmation arrived. A secure message from Congresswoman Diane Hayes, chair of the House Intelligence Oversight Subcommittee, acknowledging receipt of our evidence package and initiating emergency committee protocols. Similar confirmations followed from the alternative channels identified in Winters' intelligence, suggesting successful distribution across multiple oversight authorities. The standard disclosure channels also reported successful delivery, though without specific confirmation of review initiation. By 8:30 a.m., the disclosure operation was complete, with evidence successfully delivered through all planned channels and additional pathways. Now began the tense waiting period, monitoring for indications that appropriate authorities were acting on the evidence provided. Thomas maintained heightened security protocols throughout the compound, conscious that Blackwood's return to Washington might indicate preparation for direct countermeasures against our operation. The next phase would be critical, ensuring our personal security while federal authorities assessed the evidence and initiated appropriate investigative responses. At 9:17 a.m., the first public indication of impact appeared, an announcement of emergency closed sessions for both intelligence committees, followed by unusual movement patterns at the Justice Department's National Security Division. News outlets began reporting developing situations involving unspecified national security matters, with unusual activity observed at multiple federal buildings. "It's working," Eleanor noted, monitoring the cascade of official responses. The simultaneous disclosure through multiple channels has triggered coordinated assessment protocols. They can't contain this through classification mechanisms when so many independent oversight authorities have received the evidence simultaneously. The validation of our strategy was reassuring, though I remained conscious of James's warning about Blackwood's capability for extreme measures when cornered. The public mechanisms of official response were proceeding, but Blackwood and the Prometheus Committee would have contingency plans for exactly this scenario. That concern proved warranted when our surveillance team reported another significant development. Multiple unmarked vehicles approaching from the Eastern Access Road, the team leader announced. Formation and approach pattern consistent with tactical operations. Thomas moved immediately to the security monitoring station. Thermal imaging shows approximately 12 individuals with equipment configurations suggesting tactical team. They've established position at the property boundary, but haven't initiated approach to the main compound. Federal Response Team. Or Blackwood's assets? Eleanor questioned. Impossible to determine without direct communication, Thomas replied. But the approach methodology suggests professional training rather than private contractors. They've established containment positioning without triggering our perimeter alarms, indicative of federal tactical protocols. The distinction was crucial. If these were legitimate federal responders securing our location as part of the disclosure response, engagement was appropriate. If Blackwood's assets disguised as official responders, engagement could be catastrophic. Thomas made an operational decision, maintain defensive posture, but establish limited communication through secure channels. Request authentication protocols consistent with federal response teams. As our security team implemented these instructions, I found myself contemplating the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. What had begun as a personal betrayal, James bringing his mistress to our anniversary dinner, had escalated to potential armed confrontation between federal authorities and private security assets over evidence of a biological weapons conspiracy. The Absurd disproportionality between catalyst and consequence seemed almost incomprehensible, yet it reflected the fundamental unpredictability of human events. James's casual cruelty had triggered a sequence he could never have anticipated, exposing an operation years in development through a single moment of personal indulgence. The tactical team proved to be legitimate federal agents, deployed after our disclosures reached proper authorities. Their commander presented credentials from a multi-agency task force assembled to investigate the Prometheus directive. Within hours, news broke. Coordinated raids were underway at multiple locations, including Blackwood's residences and Nexus Biotech facilities. Federal agents had secured the Helios technology and arrested key figures, though James had vanished, likely with assistance from contacts maintained through his personal contingency plan. 3 months later, congressional hearings revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The Prometheus Committee members faced charges ranging from treason to conspiracy. Lawrence Reynolds turned state's witness, providing testimony that implicated dozens of co-conspirators. I remained as Bellamy's CEO, rebuilding the company with transparent governance and legitimate research goals. The corporation eventually recovered, though the scandal's shadow lingered in financial markets. As for James, Interpol eventually located him in Singapore. During extradition, he provided a statement to media. "She wouldn't be where she is without me." He was partly right. That humiliating anniversary dinner with his mistress had catalyzed my ascension to CEO and the unraveling of a dangerous conspiracy. His betrayal had inadvertently made me the architect of his destruction.